Okay, I don't know what that was, but it was a welcome noise or some technical problem. Hello, everyone. My name's Danny Yee, and I'm a director of Oxfordshire Livable Streets. And with us today is Dr. Anna Goodman. She's an assistant professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the Department of Population Health. And today she's going to talk about low traffic neighbourhoods, about the motivations for them and about their effects. Our other panelist is Dr. Alison Hill, who many of you will know as the chair of Cyclox, the local cycling organisation, but she also has a public health background. She's worked, among other roles, as Deputy Chief Knowledge Officer for Public Health England, I believe. Anyway, low traffic neighbourhoods are, as most of you will know, extremely topical. The modal filters for the first of the new ones went in Church Cowley just this week. They probably have engineers up there putting in things on both Beecham Lane, even as I speak, and two more due to go in the next 2 weeks in Florence Park and Temple Cowley. And there's also funding for projects in the St Mary's and Divinity Road areas and in Headington. So that's also coming down the line. So Anna will be talking about the evidence from London, where she's based, but I believe she did an undergraduate degree in Oxford, so she presumably knows something about the city. Anyway, the basic plan is for her to give her presentation, which should take about 20 minutes or so. I have chat disabled, so you can concentrate on her presentation, but I'll enable it afterwards, and you can either ask questions there or ask them in the Ask a Question option, which should be the bottom of your screen, and there should be plenty of time for questions. So Alison and I will pick those up and pass them on to Anna. So over to you.
Great,
Anna?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Hi all, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, tell me if that's not working. Thank you for introducing me to talk to you. To give some, so I'm just trying to, there we go. To give some, starting with some kind of broad context about not specifically why we need low traffic neighbourhoods, but why we need to do something. This is vehicle miles in Great Britain over time. So you can see that we had a period of kind of stabilisation in the early 2000s, but more recently they've been rising again. And that trend seen nationally is also seen in Oxford. So again, there was a period where they were flat, maybe even falling, but now we've got both car and taxi miles and all motor vehicle miles increasing. And we really need to turn this around for all sorts of reasons. Obviously, the climate crisis is a big one that affects all of us. And also because just in a more local way, cars have negative impacts on people's health and on the livability of cities in all sorts of ways. And these impacts are shared unequally. So in various respects, the types of people least likely to use motor vehicles are often most likely to be harmed from them. So in this slide, it gives one example related to disability, but I think there's also many other groups you could choose that are similar, for example, children. Another bit of context that is getting into more relevant into not just why we need to do something, but why low traffic neighbourhoods in particular have become perhaps more popular, is that a lot of the increase in traffic seems to be happening on the more minor urban roads. So in London, you can see that there's been a considerable increase on the smaller residential roads, so C or unclassified compared to the larger roads in the past decade. Two big reasons for this are probably, firstly, more home deliveries, and another reason is more people using sat-navs. So because of sat-navs, it used to be the case that you'd know the local cut-throughs in your local area, but when going further afield, you'd stick to the main roads. Now sat-navs, I mean, they don't just help you, they direct you often to go down smaller roads, because that's how they're built. And part of the reason why this is important is it's not just that that's, unpleasant for someone who lives on a road that used to be quiet and now a sat-nav's putting it down. It's also linked to this important concept of induced traffic demand. So this is the idea that if you build more roads, you get more cars. You see this time and again, people build a bypass around a town and there's a reduction in congestion over time, but 10 years later, actually there's just more traffic than there ever was before. And in the same way, there's this idea that sat-navs have effectively increased the road network, and that's to some extent induced more driving. And then the converse of traffic evaporation, where if you restrict the road network, you get less total driving, also seems to be true, and that's part of what feeds into the rationale for low traffic neighbourhoods. So in terms of what they are, as I'm sure you all know because you're getting some, they use modal filters. So these are, for example, here are some bollards that people can walk through, you can cycle through, but motor vehicles can't go through. They're completely normal in some parts of the world. So in the Netherlands, this is an approach called unbundling, where they just build their urban areas so that, cars go in this bit and people walk and cycle on that bit. And there's, built in an expectation of at least some separation between the two. And that's part of why people think cycling is so common and so safe in the Netherlands. What's really neat about them potentially as an intervention is, in general, to change people's transport behaviour, you often need a mixture of stick and carrot. So incentives both to stop doing the thing you don't want and to start doing the more sustainable choice. And these are combined together in a low traffic neighbourhood. So you simultaneously get a bit of a stick, some car journeys get less convenient, and you get a carrot where walking and cycling becomes safer and more pleasant because the amount of traffic has gone down. In London, these have been happening really quite quickly in 2020. So 4% of London residents live in an area that got a low traffic neighbourhood in the middle of last year. And there's plans to build more. So I could imagine that might double in 2021. Some of you may have seen, we just had a piece out, a bit of research out recently where we were looking at the distribution of these around London, finding that they've, from an equity point of view, it's mostly been good news in that poor areas have been much more likely to get them than richer areas. Although also within that, there was quite a lot of variation. So there was, to some extent, a postcode lottery in London of some boroughs did nothing, some did lots. Boroughs tended to prioritise their poor areas, but some didn't. In Oxford, you know more about this than me, you're getting these three low traffic neighbourhoods, which are going in right now. So what do we know about low traffic neighbourhoods and their impacts? That's particularly what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation based on research I did in Waltham Forest in Outer London. So this is an interesting place to study because they have been doing low traffic neighbourhoods between 2015 and 2019. So it's recent enough to feel relevant, but it's long enough ago that there's been some time to follow up and look at their impacts. Outer London is also interesting because although I think inner London people sometimes rightly think is just different to most urban parts of the UK and you can't generalise from it, Outer London is actually a lot more similar in terms of levels of car dependency, density to other cities in the UK. So I think it's at least possible that what you'd find in Outer London would be applicable to other urban areas in the UK, including, I would think, potentially Oxford. And all the results I'm about to show you are controlled before and after studies. So they're saying, what was the trend, what was the change in these areas that progressively got low traffic neighbourhoods compared to the rest of the borough or the rest of Outer London? So to start with active travel, based on a survey that we'd been running for some years, we saw a marked increase in walking and cycling. The survey was not very big. We didn't design it originally to study low traffic neighbourhoods per se. So the sample in the low traffic neighbourhoods was not as big as would be ideal. So there's a decent amount of uncertainty around whether the effects are, big, very big, modest. But certainly the consistent trend was that there was a fairly important increase in the amount of walking cycling that local residents did. And certainly that seemed to be larger than in places getting other sorts of active travel infrastructure, for example, new cycle tracks. In relation to car ownership, so the other half of modal shift, you want to get people out of cars and onto walking and cycling, and both parts of that equation have important health and environmental benefits. Then using comprehensive data on vehicle ownership, we found a really quite important decrease in car ownership in Waltham Forest after 3 years, so 7% down after 3 years. And again, this effect was bigger than areas getting other walking and cycling schemes like cycle tracks, although I would say even a 2% decrease in car ownership is actually pretty impressive. Just to give some context to you, those who don't work in this field, these are really large effects for transport interventions. I'm quite used to studying things and finding no effect. I'm quite used to studying interventions and finding that maybe walking and cycling went up, but there was no shift in car use. You sometimes see that, people do more recreational walking and cycling, but car use stays the same. Occasionally, when looking at really big interventions, we find a bit of a decrease in car use. I studied a sort of multi-million-pound national scheme of sustainable transport investment, and we estimated a 1% decrease in car use in some of those areas. So to see effects this big, they're certainly the largest thing I've ever found. And I think really is part of what made me think that, wow, these are potentially important tools in our toolkit if we're trying to achieve more sustainable transport system. We also found an improvement in road safety. So this graph is showing, the blue bars are showing the number of road traffic injuries inside the low traffic neighbourhoods pre and post. A large decrease, whereas in the rest of Outer London, the trend was actually slightly up. This is showing, the bar graph is showing the absolute number of injuries, which is interesting, but really the most relevant thing is risk per trip. So for example, if cycling injuries double, but cycling tripled, actually the risk per cyclist would have gone down, which I think is the most relevant thing. When we factored in what we know about people walking, cycling more and driving less, we estimated that for all three of those modes, pedestrian, cyclist and car occupants alike, there was around a 70% reduction in road traffic injury risk, which is extremely important, extremely large, and would, if replicated across our cities, would bring us in line with the best European countries. Another thing we looked at was street crime. This had sometimes come up as people, fears raised that maybe with fewer cars going through, would this leave roads deserted and therefore more exposed to mugging dangers or things like that. We'd seen concerns, so we thought we'd look at what happened to street crime in Waltham Forest. And actually we found, quite a large decrease for street crime as a whole. And that effect seemed to get bigger over time. Just to show you the kind of different categories of street crime we looked at, this line here, so 1 is the null, so 1 is no change, and then this is at 0.9, so that's the 10% decrease for all street crime. And you can see that across the sorts of things that involve direct attacks against the person, all of those trended to be less common. The stars indicate the ones that were statistically significant. And across the board, the only thing that increased significantly was bicycle theft, which is plausibly, at least partly, because people are cycling more in Waltham Forest. So it's likely that this effect would look less bad if you did it on a per bicycle basis. These effects would look even more impressive if you did them on a per pedestrian basis. And this decrease in vehicle crime might look a bit less impressive if you did it on a per car basis, because we know people are also giving up their cars in this area. So to summarise what we found in Waltham Forest, more active travel and less car ownership, safer both in terms of road injury and street crime. We also looked at emergency response times. It's another thing that often comes up when people are thinking, what could the impacts of low traffic neighbourhoods be? And we found no impact on them within the low traffic neighbourhoods, and perhaps a slight improvement on the boundary roads. So overall, at least for Waltham Forest, I think the results consistently show a very successful programme that has created more sustainable transport patterns and also more livable areas. The big question, of course, is how far these results will be replicated, both for those low traffic neighbourhoods already created, and potentially these could be scaled up very substantially. Most residential streets, most streets are minor residential streets that would be potentially amenable to low traffic neighbourhoods. I think that's, I think it's an important question, because the Waltham Forest programme involved, it was something like £25 million, involved substantial investment in kind of doing these things with, beautiful, not just a kind of, a wooden planter, but, beautiful public realm improvements, hard engineering. And obviously the ones done under the COVID response have been done more on the cheap. So, that is an open question, but so far the data coming out of London suggests certainly the impacts on increased active travel and reduced car use are also being seen in these new emergency emergency low traffic neighbourhoods. In terms of taking questions, I'm going to be very happy to talk about all sorts of things, and I expect there'll be lots of topics that come up. One thing I just wanted to say first, because I know people always ask about this, and it's a really important question, is to start with giving my thoughts about main roads. So in London, where we've looked at the main road question in a bit, about 9% of people live on main roads and high streets. People sometimes have had the perception that these people are poor or more ethnically diverse. You sometimes get social justice critiques around LTNs about shifting cars off green leafy streets onto places where kind of poorer and non-white people live. This doesn't actually seem to be true. People living on main roads and people living on side roads seem very similar in their socio-demographic characteristics. But it's definitely true that we really need to think about people living on main roads. They really, obviously they matter because they're our fellow citizens. They matter because they are often exposed to higher pollution and traffic levels to start with. And also main roads, even if you don't live on one, it matters to everyone because everyone goes on main roads some of the time. So just like I don't think you need to live in a low traffic neighbourhood to benefit from it if it provides a nice cycle route to your school, I think you don't need to live on a main road to disbenefit if it's congested, polluted, etc. In terms of how this ties into low traffic neighbourhoods, I think in the short term, low traffic neighbourhoods, I expect you're seeing it in Oxford. You get some amount of chaos everywhere. People don't see the signs. People haven't noticed the change. The sat-navs hasn't been updated. So there's chaos inside them. There's often acute congestion on the boundaries. And I think in the first days and weeks, there's not very much one can do about that. And one can't start making judgments about the success of the LTNs over that first time period. In the medium term, I think it'd be really good to have more evidence on this. And it's starting to come out of London, but I think we do need more evidence. Based on what I've seen so far, my expectation is generally you'll end up in a place where the main roads the acute congestion will come down, but you'll probably end up at a level roughly similar to where you were before. So you won't have long-term acute congestion, but you won't, have a massive transformation for the better. Probably, it's linked to the idea of induced demand, and roads tend to get used to their capacity. If your road was at capacity before, the LTN probably won't solve that. Equally, though, scrapping the LTN probably won't solve that either. And the really important thing, I think, is that for main roads, you need main road solutions. You need stuff that actively makes the main roads better. So clean air zones are a big part of that. They benefit everyone, but they particularly have benefits for air pollution on main roads. Electrifying buses. We've got far too many dirty diesel buses in London. I bet you do in Oxford as well. And we need to try and move those as fast as we can to electric. Sometimes there's scope for separating vehicles from vulnerable road users, so wider pavements, protected cycling space. Some high streets, actually, you can do traffic reduction measures as well. But really, I think main roads are one of the reasons why, to me, low traffic neighbourhoods are just the start. I think they are an impressive tool in our toolkit, but particularly because they won't in themselves reduce traffic substantially on main roads. It's why we need to think, well, this is start, and we need complementary measures on main roads, and ultimately where we need to get to, both for health and environmental reasons, is low traffic towns. And that's it. And I'll be very happy to talk more and take questions.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Hi there.
Okay, I've enabled chat again, so you can talk to yourself there, and you can also ask questions using the question thing. So I'm just going to look for any interesting questions. Okay.
Are we getting Alison back as well?
Oh yes, I'll get Alison back. Alison? It's Alison. Oh, I think she's left herself, so I have to...
So shall I start talking about this question, the one I've just seen from Charlie Hicks about evidence from London?
Yeah, well, feel free. Hang on.
So while you get Alison, I'll talk to that. So I think much of the evidence so far, certainly the stuff I've been involved in so far, there hasn't been time to look at impacts. It's been about where have they been put? So that work I was presenting. There's one borough there's one LTN in Lambeth that has just released its monitoring data, which shows 31% decrease in car traffic across the area. So both the kind of area inside the LTN and the boundary roads, that's gone down by 31%. It's gone up by, cycling's gone up by 32%. And interesting, actually, there on the boundary roads as well, you've got a decrease in total traffic. So that's, I think, been a very interesting one. I think it's certainly pointing towards the potential of these measures for substantial mode shift. I think the boundary road evidence of decreased traffic on the boundary road, I find it fascinating, but I think my view is we'll have to wait till we see a few more LTNs before seeing, what the general trend is and in what conditions boundary roads go up or down or stay about the same.
Okay, there's a question about retail, shop footfall, and local independent shops that are worried about losing trade. So is there any evidence on that?
So not from the Waltham Forest LTNs, as far as I know. I think there's quite a big body of evidence about making areas nicer for walking and cycling and making areas people want to stay and want to be can actually be really good for shops. They become places to go to and hang out. I think time and again, and I see this in my research and also just in observation, I think shops are always worried about measures that restrict car use. I think shopkeepers, when you do surveys, routinely substantially overestimate how many of their customers come by car. I mean, typically doubling. So whatever the level is, about double will be what shopkeepers estimate is the research I've seen on that. And I think typically these things actually can be very good for shops, particularly if you do some placemaking as part of it, and these become places where people want to go and want to hang out.
Okay. So someone's talking about your connection with Dutch unbundling. Saying that the Dutch unbundling is actually separating sort of primary cycle routes from primary car routes, rather than like the back streets in Dutch towns, I understand, actually are just shared space. So they're not actually unbundled. That they're sort of, in a sense that the back streets in the low traffic neighbourhoods can be shared by cars and cycling. So I think they're just commenting on that. That's not actually
interesting.
unbundling.
I looked at I may be wrong. About that. I'd been told it. I'd understood that the Dutch, this isn't quite the point I made, had a principle where you need either segregated cycle routes, or if you share space, it has to be areas with very low levels of traffic, which of course, low traffic neighbourhoods, you're also sharing space. It's just you've not got as much traffic. So I'd be, please send me that and I'll look into it more. But I'm not sure that's incompatible with what low traffic neighbourhoods do. You are still sharing space, just that is only really acceptable. It's only safe for child to cycle, etc., if the volume is low.
Danny, could I ask a question as well?
Yes.
It's a fantastic talk. Thank you, Anna, and really reassuring. One of the problems in Oxford is we are getting a lot of development happening right outside the boundaries of the city, and they are being designed as low traffic neighbourhoods, but actually they are building in car dependency because there are no amenities nearby them. So we've got to think carefully about what, low traffic neighbourhoods are great, but they're not good if you don't have things to go to nearby.
I agree. I'm getting terrible feedback. I don't know if anyone else is. It might be you, Alison, your mic, if you could mute. And sorry. Yeah, I completely agree. I think we need, this, they're only one tool in our toolkit, and we need, this idea of the 15-minute city or the 20-minute city, the idea that, we need to live in places where, they're pleasant to be and you can do a lot of your stuff there without needing to build your life around driving, or even just traveling in general. Long distances to get to all sorts of things is the way we need to go.
Okay, there's a question about pre-trial data, but if you haven't collected data pre-trial, it's hard to evaluate the effects. So, I guess that's part of the problem here, is that because these were done as kind of an emergency measures, the county doesn't necessarily have collected much data on neighbourhoods beforehand. But on the other hand, you've been forced to use this, even with Waltham Forest, you were forced to use natural experiments to a certain extent, weren't you? You haven't had, even in Waltham Forest, you didn't have good baseline data, really, did you?
Well, I think so. There's two. I agree. I think it's been a real issue. The 2020 LTNs in particular, happened so fast, often with zero pre-data, and also you're trying, it's happening in a pandemic, so travel patterns are kind of crazy anyway. So almost anything you see happening locally, it could be the low traffic neighbourhood, could be the pandemic, who knows? The sorts of stuff I've done is trying to think, well, what routine sources do we have? So, for example, car ownership, that's routinely collected by DVLA. In due course, you may have census data, although that'll be a few years till it comes out, and it remains to be seen how useful the census data is, given people will be working from home. I think in London, for example, one can get, well, at least we're trying to get bus data. Some of these apps like Uber release kind of historical congestion data. So I think there are data sources one can try and get to which have before data, are kind of just collected all the time. So you can look at the before and look at the after and choose a control group. But I agree that without that, it's really tricky to do evaluation. I'd have hoped that Oxford, doing this in 2021, would have had the chance to do at least some baseline monitoring, some strips across the road and stuff. But I don't know if it has or not.
Yeah. There's a question about people with disability, physical or learning disabilities, and older people managing in low traffic neighbourhoods.
So it's a really good, I thought it was a very good report about disability in low traffic neighbourhoods produced by the group Transport for All, which was it's kind of surveying various people with a range of disabilities living in low traffic neighbourhoods in London. I think to my mind that an important thing about people with disabilities is they're really varied in their transport needs. All people are, and I think people with disabilities even more so. So I think you get a real spectrum from people for whom cars really are a mobility aid. They need to use them to get around, and for them this is just a source of inconvenience. They can't easily switch, and maybe they're dealing with other difficulties because of their disability that make the inconvenience particularly kind of onerous. So on one side, sets of people who maybe disbenefit. On the other side, some people with disabilities who can't use a car, who could potentially bicycle, but even more than people on a regular bicycle, need very quiet, safe streets because of the nature of their bicycle, or are using mobility scooters and the like, which you can only really use on a road if there's very few cars around. And of course, my husband has a disability and he actually can't either cycle or drive because of it. But he'd love if we lived in a low traffic neighbourhood, which we don't, just because you spend a lot of time locally and you get the benefits of cleaner air, etc. So I think, there's no one answer to that. I think one of the points which the Transport for All report made is that the status quo for people with disabilities was really quite poor in transport. We often had very inaccessible environments, and LTNs for some people made that worse, for some people it made it better. But to me, the big thing is we just need to focus on making our environments more accessible in general. So making our LTN specifically more accessible, but also doing a whole range of other things to make our urban environments more accessible for people with disabilities.
The question about what councils can do to make the delivery as smooth as possible. Also a question about consultation, like how can they, in Oxford there hasn't been a lot of consultation. I guess that's a problem everywhere. People always think there's not enough consultation, but if you carried on forever, you never get anywhere. So I guess they kind of go together. What can you do to prepare to reduce the chaos stage?
So, this is not then based on my research. This is just my anecdotal views. I was kind of observing various consultations happening pre-pandemic where I felt like the level of pushback was similar actually to what we've had during the pandemic. It was, people didn't complain about the lack of consultation, but the other arguments, were put forward very strongly. One of my local, we were having a local zebra crossing put in, and the local butcher got 1,000 people sign a signature against it because it moved 7 car parking spaces. There was a lot of, I think measures that restrict car use are often controversial, and I wonder if to some extent the consultation point is sometimes a red herring. It's something people can say, but actually when you do consultations, you get a lot of the same pushback. Having said that, of course you do need to do consultations. Some places like Wandsworth did measures with 0 warning. People just suddenly thought their roads was closed. They weren't even given a leaflet 2 weeks before to say this is happening and we're doing concurrent consultation. I think if you can do it well, I quite like the model of concurrent consultation where, of course you consult in advance the services and other statutory consultees, but for residents, you give them warning and you give a kind of concurrent way to give feedback and do tweaks as you go along. Because otherwise I think you get a big status quo bias and, people are familiar with what they have and don't want to change it. And also people find it hard to envisage the alternative. So I think if you can do that, that has a lot of advantages. But I think you do then need to have a kind of responsive process of responding to tweaks and making changes as you go through. In terms of the chaos stage, I think it's really tricky. I mean, people complain about, road signs aren't good enough and the like, but I think, you need to try and get the sat navs updated as fast as possible. But, the systems are sometimes a bit buggy and it's hard to make that completely smooth. And I think people driving their familiar route probably often won't see the signs, which is kind of right. I mean, if you're driving a route, you should be focusing on where are the pedestrians, where are the cyclists. You shouldn't be trying to read every last road sign. That wouldn't make you a better driver in general, but probably does mean that you have to go down and think, oh God, there's a planter here now, and come out at least once before you then remember it the next time. So I think to some extent, I think the chaos phase is just part of the process, and you can make it a bit smoother, but I doubt you can stop it being chaos. You're on mute.
Someone's asking, could you get the same effects just with zero tolerance enforcement of 20 mile per hour speed limits? I mean, I think the answer to that's clear, because even 20 mile per hour traffic in large volumes is enough to deter people. But do you have an opinion on that, or?
Yeah, I think the same. I mean, I think lots of roads have, fairly high compliance of speed limits, particularly if they're congested and people can't go faster, but that still makes them polluted and hostile, not somewhere you'd want to cycle with an 8-year-old.
Yeah. There's a question about how do we ensure that debate's not dominated by more affluent car owners? So.
I mean, good question. I think it's a hard one, because I think a lot of noise on LTNs on both sides is made by a small number of people kind of on Twitter who feel very strongly. And I think it's always a challenge for councillors who are trying to kind of see beyond that and think, well, what do people in general think? I mean, I guess my view would be you try and do, when you're getting feedback, you try and do it in a way where you get as many households as possible to take part. If you're trying to find out what residents in your area think, you want to talk to a lot of them, including people who may just have views somewhere in the middle. I also think, it's important for councils to be driven by their policy as well as by the views of local people. I mean, if the policy of the council is we need more walking and cycling, we need, there is a climate emergency, we need to sustainable transport, transition, then I think that, that and is it achieving those objectives plus what do local people think should be the twin things that you're trying to bring in.
Mm-hmm. Questions, traffic displacement, I think you already answered that. There's a very technical question about whether this is cul-de-sac guidance was right, and that the LTNs in London are supported by local high streets, which I guess is, well, I guess East Country, Cowley ones are surrounded all around a central high street in the sense of Cowley shopping centre, but it's not really a high street. I don't know.
I didn't really understand the question, sorry.
It's a bit complicated. I think you have to. I
think I can't see the questions. You can. I can only see the chat. Yeah.
Okay.
One on traffic evaporation.
Oh no, wait! I can see it now. Aha! I'd missed the question bit. But also which sorry, I'd missed the question bit. I've seen it now, but I don't know which one it is. Oh, the LTN guidance, the former cul-de-sac guidance was somehow right. So connected high streets, an essential part of LTNs. I mean, maybe that points to what Alison was saying a while ago about the kind of building new housing areas, but without anywhere to go nearby, is sort of building a demand for travel. And, I agree. I mean, I think an LTN itself can't solve whether there's a shopping parade nearby or not. I mean, that to some extent, that's currently built into our current landscape. But it certainly makes sense to me somewhere like Cowley, where there are lots of local shops that you can and places to get to by foot and bike are, an excellent place for an LTN.
The other one of the questions, sorry about my interference, but is about traffic evaporation from Rebecca. And it'd be helpful to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I can see the whole concept of traffic, evaporatable traffic. I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question because that's quite a broad question. I mean, I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of car trips could reasonably be made in a different way. I think the main reason why people make short car trips is convenience and habit. So they do it either because they always do it or they do it because it's raining, and the alternative would be a bit more of a hassle. But in London, and I don't know the figures for Oxford, the estimate is something like 80% of London car trips, could reasonably be made by public transport or walking or cycling. And I think that is where the evaporatable traffic comes from. There is a large pool of trips that could be done in a different way. And if you either make the alternatives more attractive or you give people a bit of a nudge with a stick, or ideally do both, and that's what makes LTN design somewhat neat, a chunk of people will shift. And that does seem empirically to be what one observes, both that more people drive if you build more roads and that you get a reduction in total traffic if you restrict car use in some way.
Yes, I guess it's hard. We don't have the same quality of traffic data in Oxford as Transport for London seems to have. So I don't think we have any equivalent of that figure of, 60% of car miles in Oxford are driven by, people doing trips under 2 miles or something like that. And we also have I guess London has a commute problem too, but Oxford has a big kind of one-way commute problem, as it were. That's 30,000 people drive into Oxford every working day in normal circumstances to work, and that kind of tends to swamp the issue. So here, I guess it's the same. The issue is getting the through traffic off the roads and deterring some of that, because congestion will kind of self-limit, I guess. If it gets worse, people will switch to buses or working from home or working different hours. Or change.
I mean, I think Oxford better than I do, but for some of those things, one can at least do things like park and ride, which I know you have a bit in trying to really, get the cars only stopping at the end. But I think it is, we've built ourselves into a poor situation. If people have been buying houses on the expectation they can drive 40 miles to work and back each day, well, now they live there and that's baked into their life, and it's hard to turn that ship around. So I think you do it step by step. You start with the you start with the park and ride, and then maybe home working or remote working hubs, or trying to, people come into the office less often, or, other ways, you try and, long run, you are trying to change, things like quite fundamental things like, where do people choose to live relative to where they work? Do they prioritize being near a bus stop, or do they think, well, it doesn't matter because I can get a car, that kind of stuff.
There's a question about location of the filters in an LTN, whether you put them in the middle to enable residents to get to their nearest arterial route, or whether you try to push them in particular directions. Yeah,
good question. I don't know the answer to that. From the LTNs I've seen, I think they're often, each one is its own weird, unique engineering problem. One will have a waste site in the middle of it. So you need to think how the HGVs get in and out of that. Another one will have 2 schools, and you want to be, I think each of them probably have, I think the kind of local specific things to worry about. I know one of yours has a very strategic cycle route through the middle of it, so they kind of tried to prioritize keeping cars off that. That's a very specific thing. So I think in general, I can see the advantage of. Well, I don't know. I think it probably depends on each one. I mean, I think you're trying for local people, is probably the guiding thing, is to try and make it as, easy as possible for them to get out. So you don't have to do a crazy wiggle all the way through your LTN every time you get somewhere. So I think in the middle is a good starting point, but I think it will usually mostly be dominated by the specifics of the place.
Yeah. Talking about schools, have you got any updates about schools? So my major concern about the Cowley low traffic neighbourhoods is the school run traffic, which it's not going to be not necessarily going to disappear. So the through traffic will just disappear. The commuter traffic won't go through these areas because it can't. But the school traffic, run traffic, is in and out.
And so that you get a million cars going in and going out, and they have to be turning round. So, yeah.
Have you got any data about the effects of the LTNs on schools yet, active travel rates or anything like that, or how to get modal shift in schools? I mean, the problem is that the schools are very, preoccupied with other matters at the moment. So it's very hard to get much get them to invest much energy in trying to, encourage active travel or, that kind of thing. But I mean,
yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about these schools to say very specific things. I mean, in one of the a small proof of concept study I did locally to me, where we compared rates of cycling around a modal filter with a control site nearby, and they both happen to have pre-data from before the pandemic. There was a doubling of cycling in general and a 7-fold increase in kids cycling to school. So I think, if the catchment area of these schools is fairly local, you might see, one would hope, a large increase in the proportion of children cycling to school anyway. I know Oxford starts from a higher cycling base, so maybe the pent-up demand is smaller, but some of it might be solved in that way. I think school streets are an interesting thing to think about in combination with low traffic neighbourhoods. So school streets, for those who don't know, are where you restrict cars on a particular school road, just say 8:30 to 9:30 and 3 to 4 p.m. or whatever the kind of drop off and pick up times are. So people can kind of, if they want to drive their kid, they have to park not outside the school, but a bit further away. And in general, I think those can be nice in terms of reducing kids' exposure to air pollution and road danger immediately around the traffic gate. These are places where, lots of kids are pouring, milling around. And if you have cars parking and reversing, that's dangerous. By themselves, they don't have a massive effect on mode shift. We recently did a study where the kind of best estimate we had was something like 2 to 3% of kids switch from car use to another mode if you do a school street. But in the few cases where we saw a school street plus an LTN, much bigger effects were seen. I mean, this was based on, I think, 1 or 2 schools, so one would need to do more evidence. But it makes some sense to me that if you're simultaneously, it's another little stick of, well, you can't drive all the way there. It's another nudge to think, do you really need to be driving this? Plus also, here's a lovely LTN that you could cycle through. That can be a way to, start shifting a larger number of people. School street. Ask for school street.
Okay, 2 more questions maybe. Someone's asked about bus services, that there's sort of poor connectivity, or there's relatively good connectivity into the city, but not anywhere else, I would say, in East Oxford. Has demand for public transport actually increased in any of the low traffic neighbourhoods?
I think it would be really hard to say because of COVID. I mean, that's the really difficult thing about this context is so many people are understandably keeping off public transport. I mean, long term, you'd expect, if people are incentivized to shift away from their car, then yes, but particularly if you do it in combination with main road measures like 24/7 bus lanes, some boundary roads to LTNs in London have done that, or creating new bus lanes, because again, it's the kind of stick and carrot thing. I mean, I think LTNs provide a big carrot to walking and cycling. They make it safer and more pleasant. I think to make bus journeys better, you need to do extra stuff like bus lanes to kind of really boost them up the kind of, the preference.
Yeah, someone's asking about bus gates. So Oxford, I don't know if you know, has a quite big plan called Connecting Oxford, which would basically mean putting bus gates on a lot of the main routes, make it almost impossible to drive through the city centre to get anywhere. At least in peak hour, it's not clear what the scope would be. I guess you don't know about that because it's kind of Oxford specific.
So bus gate, I mean, I think of, you tell me if I'm misunderstanding what they mean. I mean, bus gates, to me, a bus gate is a type of modal filter that uses, instead of physical plants, it uses a camera. So, if you're a bus, you can go through, but anyone else, they'll fine you. So it has most of the same effects as a modal filter. It's just that there's also a bus running. Is that?
Yeah, so there are 2 of those in the LTNs going in now, but the bus gates that people are talking about are the ones that will actually go on main roads. So the kind of in the centre of Oxford. To put them on really big main roads, Worcester Street, I don't know if you know, Thames Street, possibly Longwall Street, or just north of that, somewhere like that. So it would effectively make driving through trips through the city centre impossible and prioritise buses on those routes. So I mean, that would obviously help buses, which is why they're doing it. But
in London, you had quite a shift away from cars in the sort of 90s, early 2000s, and a chunk of that was reallocating road space from cars to bus lanes. So there was a big push to make new bus lanes. Bus services got a lot better and more reliable, and you did see that modal shift. So from that sort of evidence base, I exactly would expect this is the kind of thing that then makes the bus the more convenient choice, which is what you want. It's always about, thinking how can we push the healthier and more sustainable transport choice, to also the top of the kind of what's easiest and most convenient list.
There's a nice question. Can you hear me all right? About future research opportunities in low traffic neighbourhoods from Katie. And I will switch off again.
Yeah, so someone's asking about research. Can you see any research on Oxford, basically? Do you know everyone who's going to be doing the studies that you've been doing in London, kind of, yes, or?
I don't know. I don't know in Oxford.
Come up here and do some data collection and analysis.
I mean, I think I am. I mean, I say I don't know. I've recently, I'm part of a consortium that's recently been awarded by the DfT the contract to evaluate the active travel fund as a whole, which is all sorts of things, but that probably is funding your Oxford low traffic neighbourhoods. And because I'm super interested in low traffic neighbourhoods, I hope we will be able to do a kind of national evaluation of them as part of that. I think that would probably be, be things like the car ownership data sets. It's stuff that, or maybe the census, if that ends up producing any useful data, that will be, a small number of data sets that we can look at nationally. I think, the first thing in my mind, my first research priority is to see how far do the, really positive effects in Waltham Forest replicate in these low traffic neighbourhoods that have been done kind of, cheaper and quicker. And I think it's also interesting to think how that varies by context. So I think Oxford, starts from a higher cycling culture place. So how does that play out? For livability stuff, that sounds super interesting, but that's sort of thing where you probably need qualitative research or surveys or, kind of on the ground. Or you tell me if people have ideas of ways one could do that kind of quantitatively at a distance, I'd be delighted. But if not, I don't know. But you do have really great transport researchers in Oxford. So hopefully some of them will pick it up.
Volunteers have done something. So, for example, the counts on Divinity Road, like 10 years apart, and volunteers did counts on the Florence Park area trying to track number plates to see actual routing. But there wasn't much guidance for that, I think. It'd be good if someone could come up with a toolkit that perhaps could be used nationally so that the data was standardized. How do you do a traffic count on an area? What are you looking for? What should you be monitoring? What periods do you go for? Do you need to do half an hour count? That kind of thing. So if someone nationally were to try and coordinate something like that, that might be quite useful because, you get more data and more useful data that way.
That's part of our job in this evaluation we're doing for Department for Transport is try and do that for councils, telling councils this is the data we want and this is how we want it and in a kind of consistent way. Because really, it's a funny thing. Lots of people, including to some extent myself, although for me it is also my job. I've seen lots of people counting traffic locally to me, like both people who love the LTNs counting the bikes and people who kind of hate the LTNs counting the cars. And I'm sort of laughing, but just I sometimes have found it funny where it's like mid-pandemic, there's no before data, there's no control group. I think, what on earth do you think you're learning? But I think, there is, people have a real appetite to do it. My view is it ought to be done by councils because that's kind of their job. So I think good guidance that councils can use for it, or maybe some bodies like Cyclops. I feel like people should just get on with enjoying their lives and enjoying their LTNs.
I think the problem with the councils is that it's quite possible that, in the same way we end up with green cycle lanes in one council and blue cycle lanes in another, that they'll take completely different methodologies for data collection and come up with compatible. So
that's the kind of coordinating role of trying to say this is the evaluation framework. Can you please, count this on this? Yeah, no, I agree. Which we'll try to have via DfT.
Okay, well, I think that's everything. Anyone else got any quick questions they want to bung into the questions? Key areas for future research. I think we've kind of covered that. What you're trying to do.
Slides will be available for people who asked it. I think I'll send them to Danny and he'll email them to you or however you've registered.
Yep. Okay. So if you've lost all interested in the slides, so just email us. Yeah. We'll put them on our website probably, and email all the attendees.
Yeah. And I just see one other question about the LTNs and 20 mile per hour ones. I think 20 mile an hour zones they have an important impact on road safety. I think the estimate was something like the blanket introduction of them in London on roads, 20 to 30%. It was something of that order in relation to road traffic injuries, which is smaller than the 70% we found in Waltham Forest, although it would be good to replicate that in other areas. So I think they are important in relation to road safety. We haven't seen, in London, we've been doing 20 mile an hour zones for ages, and they don't mostly lead to large mode shift. And you could think of enforcing them better, but I think still there's a certain volume of cars that just becomes hostile for driving. I think speeding is a problem, but I think car volumes are a bigger deterrent. Okay.
Well, I think that's everything. Oh, cumulative emissions or something. One end, understand data on the impact of one LTN on another.
That's okay, Tom. Yeah, interesting. So you mean like if you do 3 together, is the bang for the buck more than doing just one? Maybe that sort of thing. I think there's not yet useful data on that because there haven't been many yet, and only now we're starting to see anything like a network. I mean, my assumption is that you'll get multiplicative benefits, because I think what you really need is not just safe routes but a safe network. So I would expect that once you can get not just in your very local area but further and away by walking, cycling, you'll see bigger mode shift. But I think that is my assumption rather than what we know yet.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Anna. And
my pleasure.
Yeah. And if you're over up in Oxford, you can come and look at some of the LTNs, and
no, I'd love to.
We'll send you whatever data we can find if we can get anything useful. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you, Alison, and thank you everyone for coming.
No, thank you all. Thank you for the questions.
Okay, bye.